Welcome everyone. We'll get started with today's webinar. My name is Emily Sartoretto and I'm the Interim Communications Manager at the Canadian Public Health Association, and I'll be moderating the session today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you as well for your understanding a few weeks ago when we had technical issues with the platform. Everything is fixed for today, and fingers crossed everything will go smoothly. Before we get started with the main event, let me tell you a little bit about the Canadian Public Health Association. At the association, one key area of our work is to advocate for public health, speaking up for people and populations to all levels of government. We champion health equity, social justice, and evidence-informed decision-making. We leverage knowledge, identify and address emergent public health issues, and connect diverse communities of practice. We promote the public health perspective and evidence to government leaders and policymakers. And we are a catalyst for change that improves health and well-being for all. Our vision is a healthy, just world, and our mission is to enhance the health of people in Canada and to contribute to a healthier and more equitable world. Our strategic plan will also give you an idea of who we are. By 2020, we hope to achieve the following. To be a national independent evidence-based voice for public health in Canada, to represent public health's communities of interest in public system renewal, to be a convener of partners to identify solutions to public health issues, to have a dynamic and engaged membership, to be a financially and organizationally resilient and sustainable organization, and to inspire and motivate change in support of health equity. This webinar is part of a monthly series, and we hope that you can join us for future sessions. The next one on public health and urban planning is happening next week. I'll share a link to register to that if you're interested at the end of the webinar. So how does this work? Beside active listening, we hope to engage you throughout the webinar. So you can update your status throughout. You can see the image on the left. You have a few options there. And if you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet using the webinar hashtag, and that is CPHA webinar. I'll post that in the chat box. And we ask you to submit your questions in the chat box. I'll be moderating them, and we'll be going through them during the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentation. So we encourage you to make these comments available or visible to everyone, and we'll attempt to answer all of the questions. If we don't have a chance, we'll answer them via email. And we'll also be sharing the presenters' slides and the recording after the webinar among the registered participants. And we'll make these more widely available later in about 3 months. One last thing before I introduce today's speaker, and this is very timely with today's webinar on conference presenting. The Canadian Public Health Association launched the call for submissions for our annual conference, Public Health 2018. That's happening in Montreal next May. And we encourage you to consider submitting a submission for that. The best way for you to stay up to date on all the important conference information, including the call for submission and registration information, is to sign up to our mailing list. So I'll share the link with that, and if you wanted to subscribe, you'll be sure to receive all the key information. So now on to the main event. Today, our speaker is Jessie Lee McIsaac. Jessie Lee has a PhD in public health from the University of Alberta and is a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University, funded by the Canadian Cancer Society Research Institute. She has a background in health promotion and policy interventions related to chronic disease prevention and skills in case study research, qualitative methodologies, program evaluation, and knowledge translation. Jessie Lee's program of research focuses on supporting the implementation of effective strategies to promote child and youth health. During her fellowship, she's working alongside policy and practice partners to study the implementation of school policy interventions that are designed to support healthy eating and physical activity. Welcome, Jessie Lee. I turn the mic over to you.
Great, thanks so much for the invitation to present today, and thanks. I echo the thanks that was already shared to those that were able to register and attend twice for this webinar. I found it a bit funny that the presentation on presentations had a technical issue, and that certainly may happen when you plan a presentation. You can put a lot of work into all the preparation, yet some things are just out of your control. So it was a little bit of a dose of reality, I think, when it comes to these things. So thanks so much again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Today, I'm going to share a bit about my experiences with presentations through a number of different elements that can be thought about. So first, I'll talk about some considerations that you may have before actually applying to attend or present at a conference. Also, some things to consider when preparing and submitting an abstract. Then talk about actually the mechanics of presentations themselves, whether it be oral, poster, workshop, panels, when it comes to preparing those presentations, delivering them, and also some aspects to consider when it comes to responding to questions. And finally, I'll kind of wrap up with a bit about what I try to do in learning from the experiences that I have with presentations. And then, of course, we'll end with discussion. Before I get started, though, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me clearly. I don't see anything in the chat saying otherwise, so I'll take that as a good sign. Okay. So first, before I get started with the presentation, and I have a couple of these thrown into the presentation to kind of liven things up. So Chris says that my sound is breaking up. Can I just ask if that's for others as well? I see some people typing, so I'm just going to stop. Oh, Lori can hear me. Joanne can hear me. So Chris, that might be something to do with your speakers. If you wanted to maybe try logging in and logging out, perhaps that would help. Thanks for those that responded saying you can hear me clearly, and I'll try to keep an eye in the chat box as I go. So, and also, if you haven't had the opportunity yet to try out the poll question, if you could, I'm really curious about your experiences with presentations, just to provide some context to the presentation and how I deliver things. So it looks like there's lots that have had some presentation experience, so that's great. Awesome. Definitely when we look at that range, there's a lot of folks that have some experiences with presentations, which is fantastic. So I encourage you as well during the discussion. It's a question and answer to me, but we can all share our experiences in that way as well. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So just to tell you a bit more about my conference experience, just to give you an idea of where I'm bringing my experiences when it comes to what I'm going to be sharing today. So I've had the privilege of attending a number of local, national, and international conferences. So mostly related to public health, health promotion, physical activity and healthy eating, and also some of my work in school health promotion. A range of different places as well. I've been really lucky to have been able to travel to a number of different provinces and even internationally to attend. I've delivered a number of different styles of presentation, both oral, poster, and also workshops and panels. I've received some funding awards, which is, I think, a really important part, especially for those that are graduate students and thinking about how you can get to go to all these types of conferences. And I'll share a bit about some of my experiences with that to hope to perhaps inform what you might be able to think about when thinking about funding. I've also had the opportunity to be a member of scientific and steering committees, most recently with the public health 2016 and 15 conferences. So I was the student representative, which was a great experience to really understand and be involved with the inside of a conference to really kind of get the big picture of all the details that are a part of planning and executing a good conference. So that some of my experiences are through that lens as well. And I've also had the opportunity to be an adjudicator for poster presentations and oral presentations and for some different awards that were given out. So that's sort of where my experience comes from. The next poll that I'm going to do, and you can see there, I've thrown a few PhD comics for those that are familiar with those that talk about different conference elements, which I find to be really funny. So you can see that this comic, the first question is the conference in an exotic location? So location is certainly an element of your considerations to apply to a conference, but there are some other things as well in the flow chart that they've indicated, and also some things that I found to be of importance when thinking about applying to a conference. So the poll is, what's your primary consideration? There's lots to think about, I know. But what really drives your motivation to submit to a conference in terms of sort of that first consideration? I'm curious what your thoughts are. You can see the live poll. There's no one selecting interesting location, which is good, I think. Great. So relevance is certainly coming out. Okay, it's kind of going back and forth, I think. But it looks like relevance is winning there in terms of the primary consideration: networking, professional development, and available funding. That's great, and I really enjoy the comic, and I think it just provides a little bit of a laugh as to be thinking about some of our reasonings for attending. For me, however. The top three considerations for me, and really the first one for me, is about the relevance. And that came out, it seemed, from your perspectives as well. The relevance of the content with the conference objectives and the tracks. So that's usually when I think about going to a conference. I think about, is it relevant for the material that I have? That's my primary consideration in terms of driving it. Also, my secondary consideration is really thinking about where I'm at in sort of my training, and if the conference offers some good opportunities for training or for professional and career development. So most recently, it was mentioned in the introduction that I have some experience with knowledge translation, and that's something that I've been really trying to hone in on during my fellowship and gain some skills. So a lot of the conferences that I've been focusing on over the last few years have been focused on KT. So really trying to support my career development and my skill development, and also trying to establish that network of people that I'm hoping to work with going forward in my career. So that's a really important consideration for me. And then the last one, I think that funding and location are sometimes tied together. So I put those two together because often you need money to go to different places. So if the conference is not in a place that of a province or a city of which you reside, there are some funding considerations that are really important and pragmatic in terms of whether or not you can actually get yourself there. So some things about funding that I found to be successful, and certainly one thing that I don't think you should think about it as being kind of always kind of that preventer from allowing you to attend, because there are a lot of different options for conference funding that you may not even be aware about. So there's lots. So my recommendation is to start looking early. There's lots of different deadlines for submission. So a first consideration is your department or university. So often faculty of graduate studies at universities have even just a little bit of professional development funding. I know as a postdoc, I'm eligible for a certain amount throughout my fellowship and every postdoc is eligible to receive that. So that's one consideration, and sometimes, depending on where you're at, different departments also have a bit of funding. It never hurts to ask. So even if you're not sure about your department's available funds to support professional development, it's always good to ask, and the worst they can say is no, right? Another opportunity is through different funding agencies. So CIHR, for example, has several travel award competitions that they launch. Alongside of the public health conference, there's usually a specific pocket of funds that's available to support travel. I'm not sure if it's this year, but that's one that I've certainly looked at in terms of helping to support my attendance. So if you're thinking about Public Health 2018, look at the potential for available funds. Again, I'm not sure if it's available this year, but certainly look. And there can also be a different type of university associations. So I've been successful in an early career grant through the Association of Commonwealth Universities, which is an association that I really wasn't even aware of. But across the different Commonwealth countries, there's students and postdocs, trainees are able to apply for funding for this early career grant, which as I said, wasn't even aware of. But I was successful in receiving one, and that allowed me to attend an international conference, which was great considering the cost that it takes to go to those places. So I heard about that through my university, but there can be lots of different opportunities for funding that you can kind of look at. Another thing about funding that I just wanted to mention is if the conference is a place that maybe is close to you, that you can get yourself there, reach out to the conference organizers to ask if there's a way that you could volunteer your time to perhaps receive free admission to the conference or a reduced registration cost. Those things are other ways that you might be able to kind of overcome some of the funding challenges. And my last suggestion is if you are a graduate student, talk to your supervisor, because perhaps they can build it into sort of your professional development, and sometimes there are project grants that can help to support funding. So I talk about funding because I think a lot of people sometimes see that as a factor that can kind of prevent them from attending conferences. But I think as trainees, graduate students, we're really in actually a kind of a privileged position to have access to some different kinds of funds, because there's lots of attention from funding agencies and universities to help to support the professional development. So there's lots of options I have found through my experiences as a graduate student. Okay, so the next poll question that I have is what content have you presented? So I'm curious if you've presented your thesis, if it's been coursework, if it has been internship experiences, research community projects, something else. And if you select something else, I'd love for you to chat in the box there to tell me what it is. So the reason I ask this question is increasingly conferences are looking for more sharing of practical experiences. So public health is actually a great example of that, where it's not just researchers or students presenting their thesis work. And you can see here actually that a lot of people have presented so either research or community projects, not necessarily their thesis work, which is really interesting. And I'm curious kind of what maybe another time I could put a split between research or community projects. But as I was saying, public health really does provide a really good lens to practical experiences as well. And I'm thinking that some of you have had some experience with research projects, and certainly a lot of supervisors, at least those that I've worked with, are often happy for trainees to take lead on a submission. So that's something to consider if you do want to attend a conference, but perhaps your thesis isn't quite ready. That's something to be thinking about. So someone just commented that they've presented in the other, that pilot project early findings. That's perfect. Thank you. There's lots of different things that you can share. So let's move on to, the next slide there. So some considerations when you're thinking about preparing or submitting an abstract. So I already talked about some things to consider before you even apply. But what's really important when you're preparing a presentation, this is common sense a little bit, but that you know the guidelines and the assessment criteria. So unfortunately or fortunately, all conferences have different guidelines, and that's really because they're designed to for that particular conference. The guidelines are usually how you'll be assessed, so make sure you follow the different headings that they put forward, especially if there's a section around the implications of the work. So I know public health focuses on the implications to policy and practice. So really thinking about the implications of its research work to policy and practice is really important, especially if it's a conference that really brings together research, policy, practice stakeholders in that way. When you're thinking about, when you're preparing or submitting your abstract, also consider the different types of presentation formats for material. So I'll ask a poll later on the types of styles of presentations that you've done, but oral presentations tend to be the traditional way of doing conferences, but there's increasingly more different types of presentation styles. So I'm seeing a lot of 3-minute presentations or pitch presentations where you're able to kind of provide a quick summary of what your research is to engage the audience and spark some interest in the work. There's the traditional poster presentations, or sometimes I've also seen virtual poster presentations where you don't even have to attend the conference in person, but your poster is available virtually, which is also pretty neat. So there's lots of different styles of presentations. So think about your content and what might be most appropriate in terms of the format for presenting the material. All the presentations that I've done have involved a number of other people. So I've involved people, tried to involve whether it be my supervisors and my colleagues, involve them early in terms of kind of developing what it is we want to present and gathering feedback from others. So I am someone who really likes to get feedback on what I do. So that's something that I always do, is try to gather feedback and to try to build a really good abstract that will likely to be successful. And that can also help if you're new to submitting abstracts, if you're not really sure what to include, and feedback from others should help with that. So generally what's required in a typical research-focused abstract are things like your background, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, implications. But what's really important is that you use a plain language approach in the development of the abstract itself and highlight the most important points. So make sure you're following the word count style, but really thinking about using a plain language way of describing the work, because likely the reviewers will not necessarily be directly from your field, depending on how focused the conference is or broad. So really making sure that anyone can understand it. So thinking about the scope of the issues, the rationale, the methodology sometimes, data collection, analysis. So one aspect that I've encountered through my work is sometimes my work is not quite finished, but it will be by the time that the conference comes about. So what I tend to do is, if I don't have results ready to present, I provide a timeline for when they will be available. So that's really important so that the reviewer can assess that, you will be ready. Also, if you have preliminary themes that you want to include in your abstract, that can be really helpful in conveying what some of the things are that you'll be discussing. And the implications, as I said, can also be really important. Typically in abstracts, at least that I've done, there are no citations in the abstracts, but it also might depend on the content in the conference. So if the work is kind of really based on a theoretical perspective, perhaps that citation should be there. But usually in the abstracts I've been involved with or have reviewed, citations are usually saved for the presentations themselves. That, as I said, can depend on the convention of the conference or the field. Okay, so you've submitted your abstract and it's been successful. So just taking a moment to celebrate that success is really important. I know that email sometimes that you get may be exciting, but sometimes you submit for an oral presentation, but you receive a poster presentation, and that still is something to celebrate. One thing that I learned is sitting on the steering committee for CPHA is that increasingly there are fewer spots for oral presentations. There's a lot of competition and interest in presenting at conferences. A lot of people want to present if they attend a conference, which means that there's a lot of people wanting to present, and some conferences are having to kind of grapple with allowing enough people to attend while not offering too many different sessions at the same time. And I know if anyone else has attended really large conferences where you have lots going on and it can be difficult to pick and choose what you attend, that can be really hard too. So based on my experience with the steering committee at CPHA, that's one thing I learned is that, you know, if you're hoping for an oral, but you are accepted for a poster, that's not something that you should be necessarily disappointed about, because you were still accepted. You still have the opportunity to present something, and to recognize that conferences are grappling with these issues around how you have the strong abstracts accepted while still balancing that need to not have too much content that breeds almost too much competition between different sessions.
To the mic, some people are having a little bit of
to have a great oral presentation and to only have a couple people in the room, right? So the fewer sessions that are offered, the more people that can attend all the different presentations that are available during that time. Oh, sure. Sure. Thank you. Thanks. Just interrupt me if it comes up again. How does it feel now? Does it sound okay? I'll get really close. Better, but we'll let you know. Thank you. And I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. So that was really, for those that didn't hear, I was just about celebrating success and trying not to be too disappointed about a poster if it was an oral that you were hoping for, and just recognizing the balance that conferences have to think about when it comes to having some really strong abstracts accepted, while not having too many sessions going on. So that's just something to think about. Okay, moving right along. In thinking about preparing your presentation, first, before I get started with this, I just want to do a little disclaimer to say that I don't have a background in communications, but my suggestions, my considerations that I'm going to be talking about are more about based on my own experience attending conferences and preparing my own presentations. So knowing your audience and the presentation guidelines, again, similar to when you submit an abstract and you have guidelines for submitting an abstract, typically conferences send out guidelines around presentations. So how long you have, if it's an oral presentation, who else will be presenting. So if you're in a room with other people, that's an important thing to know. Also, the type of presentation that you have may indicate who you have in the room. So workshops and panels tend to be more practice based. So you may have those working in practice, perhaps a little bit more. But again, it's sometimes conferences you might not always know who's in the room, but thinking about who your potential audience might be is still an important thing to think about. When you're preparing your presentations, another thing that I think about is focusing on the most relevant and important content. So you won't have time to present everything, and that's always challenging in the limited time you have, or in a poster in the limited space that you have. But the objective of presentations, typically those short presentations, are to get people interested in your work. So focusing on the most relevant and important content can be an important principle to have when you're preparing your presentation. So in doing that, when you're preparing presentations, thinking about short, simple statements, using bullet points. Usually what I do as well in my presentations is I include references. I usually include them in sort of a numbered format rather than a long text, and have the reference list at the end. And acknowledgements always in every type of presentations are important to include, especially any funding acknowledgements if you were successful in obtaining funds. Another thing that I try to do in presentations is think about engaging formats and styles. So in any kind of presentation, using headings, incorporating relevant images, figures, and tables can be really important. So there's lots of, in terms of the format and style, there's lots of different templates that are available online. I tried to use, and I'll show you a couple of examples later of posters that I've done that have used PictoChart, which is kind of like an infographic style platform, which just allows you to have a different way of presenting information in a poster style. Images can also be a really great way to connect to the audience. I find photographs of things helpful or relevant to include. Comics can also be helpful to kind of break up presentations. When it comes to the font type, again, I'm not a communications expert, but there's lots of resources online for recommendations of different sizes and types. But generally, trying not to use more than two font types can be helpful. From what I've read, Arial or Verdana can be common ones that are easy to read. But again, it's really about using something kind of really easily visible and not too complex for someone's eyes to get too tired reading on your slide. In terms of the background of presentations, I've always found simples better, either a solid color or a gradient that complements different colors. So really having complementary colors can be helpful. And what I found is, 2 to 3 colors is enough. So if you have too many colors, it's a bit too busy. But if you have too few, or if it's black and white, it can be, a bit dull. So kind of playing around with those kinds of things, the format, the style, it can be really important when you're putting together a presentation. So I find, simple is good, and thinking about, clear colors, contrasting colors can be really helpful. One other thing that I've found is, especially in poster presentations, thinking about what might look good on your screen might not look good on in a print version is important. So whenever I print posters, I always kind of check in with the printer to make sure that from their perspective, it will look okay printed. And some of the gradient colors can be challenging in print style, and even gradient on screen can sometimes be challenging. So I know the first presentation that I prepared for today's webinar kind of had a gradient fill, and it looked a bit funny on the screen. So I decided to go with a just plain white background with the bar on the bottom. So it's always best to kind of think about these things at the front, just to kind of really ensure that the presentation that you prepare is engaging to the audience. Okay, so another poll question. What format have you presented? So I'm going to get into some format stuff lately. Or next, oral presentation, poster, workshops, panels, or other. If you've done other, please put in the chat box what it is. Both, okay. So lots of orals and posters, it looks like. Yeah, more orals than posters, great. Awesome, thank you. So we'll move right along to keep things going. All of the above. Thanks, Kirk. Yeah. Great. Awesome. So lots of experience with different types of presentations. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to start with oral presentations, and that seemed to be the most frequently selected by you all. So depends on the content, but typically a good rule of thumb that I use is to have the same amount of slides or fewer as the amount of minutes that you have to present. So if you have 12 minutes,